They faked $300 million in coffee sales. The coffee shops were real. In 2017, a Chinese startup declared war on Starbucks. Not quietly, loudly, publicly. They said they were going to open more stores faster than any coffee company in history, and they were going to do it in China, Starbucks' most important growth market in the world. Investors called it impossible. Then Luckin Coffee opened 4,500 stores in 2 years, listed on Nasdaq, and raised billions of dollars from some of the most respected funds on Wall Street. Then a short seller published a report that changed everything. $310 million in sales, completely fabricated. And the man responsible had been sitting in the chief operating officer's chair the entire time. To understand Luckin Coffee, you need to understand what China's coffee market looked like in 2017. Starbucks had been building its presence in China for nearly 2 decades. By 2017, it operated thousands of stores and considered China its single most important long-term growth market. Coffee consumption among Chinese consumers was rising rapidly, driven by a younger urban generation that saw coffee as a lifestyle statement rather than just a drink. Starbucks' position seemed almost unassailable. Then came Luckin. The company was founded by Charles Liu, who served as chief operating officer, and Jenny Qian, who became chief executive officer. Both were experienced operators from China's tech and car-hailing industry. They understood one thing that traditional coffee companies didn't. Chinese consumers lived on their phones. Everything was ordered, paid for, and tracked through apps. Luckin built its entire model around this insight. No standing in line, no complicated orders. You opened the Luckin app, chose your drink, walked to the nearest pickup point, and collected it in under 2 minutes. The stores were small, cheap to build, and designed for volume rather than atmosphere. Luckin wasn't trying to be a third place. It was trying to be the fastest, cheapest, most convenient coffee in China. The expansion was breathtaking. Luckin opened its first store in October 2017. By the end of 2018, barely 14 months later, it had over 2,000 locations. By mid-2019, it had surpassed 4,500 stores, officially overtaking Starbucks as the largest coffee chain by store count in China. No company in the history of the food and beverage industry had ever scaled that fast. In May 2019, Luckin listed on Nasdaq, raising over $650 million from international investors. The IPO was celebrated as proof that Chinese tech-driven consumer companies could compete globally. Analysts praised the model. Funds poured money in, and the stock climbed. Luckin's market capitalization reached nearly $12 billion within months of listing. Behind the scenes, however, there was a problem. The real sales numbers did not match the reported ones. The growth was real in terms of physical stores and customer traffic, but the revenue being reported to investors was significantly inflated. Charles Liu, operating deep within the company's financial reporting structure, had overseen a scheme that fabricated hundreds of millions of dollars in sales using a network of third-party entities that were, in reality, controlled by people connected to Luckin itself. The company was essentially selling coffee to itself, recording the transactions as genuine revenue, and reporting the inflated numbers to the stock market. The stores existed, the customers existed, the coffee existed, but a massive portion of the money those customers were supposedly spending did not. The warning signs at Luckin were loud enough that at least one firm decided to act on them before the collapse. In February 2020, Muddy Waters Research, a prominent short-selling firm known for exposing Chinese corporate fraud, published an anonymous 89-page report on Luckin Coffee. The report was extraordinarily detailed. It alleged that Luckin had systematically fabricated its per-store sales figures from the third quarter of 2019 onward, inflating numbers by at least 69%. Muddy Waters said the evidence came from over 11,000 hours of video footage recorded inside Luckin stores by hired trackers who physically counted customers and purchases and cross-referenced those numbers against what the company was reporting. The market's initial reaction was skeptical. Luckin immediately denied the allegations. Several analysts who covered the stock publicly dismissed the report, pointing to Luckin's impressive store count growth as evidence the business was fundamentally sound. The stock fell sharply on the day of the report's release, then partially recovered as investors decided Muddy Waters had gotten it wrong. This reaction was not unusual. Short seller reports on Chinese companies listed in the United States had a mixed track record, and many investors had grown accustomed to treating them with caution. But the earlier warning signs had been there long before Muddy Waters published anything. Independent analysts examining Luckin's financials had noted, as early as its initial public offering in 2019, that the company's claimed revenue growth was extraordinarily difficult to reconcile with observable store traffic data. The math on how much coffee Luckin would need to sell per location to justify its reported revenues was, according to some observers, physically implausible given the size and footprint of its stores. Additionally, Luckin's corporate governance structure raised red flags that institutional investors largely chose to overlook. The company's founder and chairman, Charles Liu, controlled an unusually large share of voting rights, limiting the practical ability of outside board members to scrutinize management decisions. Key financial data was reported on an aggregate basis that made store-level verification extremely difficult for external analysts. Jenny Qian, the CEO, later maintained that she had no knowledge of the fabrication scheme, which was conducted by Liu and a small group of subordinates acting outside her visibility. Whether or not that account is fully accurate remains a matter of ongoing legal dispute. What is clear is that the company's internal controls were either deliberately structured to make fraud easier to hide, or negligently designed to the point where a massive fabrication could occur without triggering any internal alarm. In either case, the outcome was the same. Hundreds of millions of dollars in fake revenue flowed through Luckin's books for months, reported to investors, signed off on by auditors, and accepted by the market as genuine evidence of a business growing at a miraculous pace. Here's the part nobody tells you. The fraud collapsed. The company didn't. What happened next at Luckin Coffee is unlike anything else we've covered on this channel. Stay with me. On April 2nd, 2020, Luckin Coffee released a statement that stunned financial markets. An internal investigation had uncovered that its own chief operating officer, Charles Liu, had fabricated approximately 2.2 billion Chinese yuan, roughly $310 million, in sales transactions during 2019. The fabrication had been conducted through a network of entities that placed fake orders through Luckin's system, creating the appearance of genuine customer revenue that was then reported to investors in official financial disclosures. The stock, which had already fallen following the Muddy Waters report, collapsed an additional 80% in a single trading day. Investors who had held shares through the Muddy Waters report, believing the allegations were unfounded, lost the vast majority of their investment in hours. Charles Liu was immediately suspended and later fired. Jenny Qian stepped back from her role as chief executive officer as the company initiated emergency governance reforms. The scale of the internal investigation that followed was extraordinary. Luckin brought in outside counsel and forensic accountants who spent months reconstructing the fake transaction network. They found that Liu had not acted entirely alone. A small group of subordinates within the company had participated in the scheme, creating and routing the fake orders through systems designed to look like genuine third-party purchases. The investigation identified specific individuals involved and produced documentation that was later handed to both Chinese and American regulatory authorities. Nasdaq moved swiftly. Luckin Coffee was formally delisted from the exchange in June 2020, less than 14 months after its celebrated initial public offering. The company faced regulatory action in both the United States and China simultaneously, a rare double exposure that reflected the cross-border nature of the fraud. The Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States eventually reached a settlement with Luckin for $180 million. Chinese regulators imposed their own fines and sanctions. For the institutional investors who had backed Luckin's initial public offering and subsequent fundraising rounds, the losses were significant. Pension funds, hedge funds, and retail investors across the United States had collectively lost billions of dollars in market capitalization during the two-day collapse. Some investors filed class action lawsuits against the company, alleging they had been misled by materially false financial statements. Those cases wound through the courts for years. But here is where Luckin's story diverges sharply from every other case we have covered on this channel. Most companies that suffer a fraud of this scale and visibility do not survive. They collapse entirely. They are acquired for pennies. They are dissolved and forgotten. Luckin did something almost nobody predicted. Under new management, stripped of its fraudulent reporting, forced to compete on its actual merits, the company restructured, cut its debt, and kept building stores. By 2021, it had returned to profitability on genuine numbers. By 2023, Luckin Coffee had overtaken Starbucks in China, not just in store count, but in actual, verified revenue. Charles Liu faced consequences on both sides of the Pacific. In China, he was investigated by domestic regulators and faced civil claims from Luckin itself, which sued him and his co-conspirators for damages related to the fraud. In the United States, the Department of Justice filed criminal charges against him. Liu fought extradition for years from his base in China, where he remained beyond the practical reach of American law enforcement. As of the time this video was produced, he has not served criminal prison time in connection with the fraud. Jenny Qian, the CEO who maintained she had no knowledge of the scheme, eventually stepped down as part of the corporate restructuring. She was not charged with criminal wrongdoing in either jurisdiction. Her reputation suffered significantly, despite the absence of formal charges, a pattern we have seen in other cases on this channel. The proximity to fraud carries its own cost, regardless of personal culpability. The new leadership team that took over Luckin after the collapse made a series of decisions that defied the conventional wisdom about how you rebuild after a fraud scandal. Rather than retreating or dramatically scaling back, they doubled down on the core business model. They kept opening stores, they kept improving the app, they kept cutting prices and expanding their menu. They leaned into the one thing that had always been genuinely true about Luckin. The coffee was fast, cheap, and good enough that millions of Chinese consumers actually wanted it. The strategy worked. By 2022, Luckin was consistently profitable on its genuine, audited numbers. By 2023, it operated over 10,000 stores in China, more than double its pre-scandal count. Its verified revenue had surpassed Starbucks China in a market that Starbucks had spent 2 decades cultivating as its most important global growth engine. The investors who lost money in the 2020 collapse never fully recovered their losses. The class action settlements provided partial compensation, but nowhere near the value that had been destroyed. The reputational damage to Chinese companies listed on American stock exchanges was lasting. Regulators in both countries significantly tightened audit and disclosure requirements for cross-listed Chinese firms, a direct consequence of what Luckin had done. For the broader financial world, Luckin became a case study in multiple contradictions. It was simultaneously one of the most brazen frauds in recent stock market history, and evidence that underneath the fraud was a business model that actually worked. The lie was real, but so was the coffee. And in a story full of betrayal and collapse, that distinction matters, because it meant that while the executives who fabricated the numbers faced consequences, the hundreds of thousands of employees who had simply shown up every day to make and serve coffee kept their jobs and eventually got to work for a company that genuinely thrived. Before we finish, drop one word in the comments. Does Luckin's survival make the fraud better or worse? They lied to investors, got caught, and then actually built the business they promised. One word, justice. Or luck. I read every single one. Some frauds destroy everything they touch. Some accidentally build something real. The next case we are covering destroyed everything. Subscribe, because you will not see this one coming.